On March 24, 2015, passengers boarded Germanwings Flight 9525 at Barcelona El Prat Airport under clear skies. The Airbus A320, built in 1991, was scheduled for a routine flight to Düsseldorf, Germany. It was a route the airline operated multiple times each day, flown by crews who knew it well. The A320 had become one of the most reliable aircraft in commercial aviation, with thousands operating worldwide. 144 passengers and 6 crew members settled in for what appeared to be an ordinary morning departure. Among them were 16 students and 2 teachers returning from the school exchange program, business travelers heading home, families beginning or ending vacations. The aircraft had recently passed maintenance checks and all systems were reported serviceable. At 10:01 local time, Flight 9525 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway. There were no technical issues reported, no delays, no abnormal indications. Everything about this departure appeared entirely routine. Nothing about the flight suggested that investigators would soon be forced to examine factors beyond aircraft systems and beyond mechanical performance. Flight 9525 lifted off at 10:01 a.m. and climbed northeast toward the French border. Inside the cockpit were 2 pilots, a captain with more than 6,000 flight hours and a first officer fully qualified to operate the Airbus A320. Both pilots had reported for duty on time, both had completed standard pre-flight procedures. Nothing in the records from that morning indicated concern. As the aircraft climbed through Barcelona's airspace, air traffic control handed the flight off normally. Radio communications were clear, professional, and routine. Weather along the planned route was favourable, with no significant turbulence forecast. By 10:27 a.m, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. The autopilot was engaged. The aircraft tracked its planned route precisely. At this point, there was no indication that this flight was anything other than routine. 2 minutes later, at 10:29 a.m, air traffic control radar detected something unexpected. Flight 9525 had begun an unannounced descent from 38,000 feet. The controller responsible for that sector immediately attempted radio contact. No response was received. In controlled airspace, altitude changes require explicit clearance. Pilots must request permission and receive approval before initiating any descent. This aircraft had done neither. The descent rate was approximately 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute. This was faster than a standard cruise descent initiated for landing, but it was steady, controlled, and consistent. The aircraft maintained its programmed heading while losing altitude at a constant rate. Controllers tried additional radio frequencies. They used different phraseology, repeated the call sign, and transmitted on emergency frequencies. Nearby aircraft were asked to relay messages. The cockpit remained silent. As the aircraft ascended through 30,000 feet, the controller checked the flight plan. The route took Flight 9525 directly over the French Alps, a mountainous region with peaks exceeding 9,000 feet. At the current descent rate and flight path, the aircraft was heading toward terrain. Controllers escalated the situation, supervisors were notified, adjacent sectors were alerted, rescue coordination centers received preliminary notification. The descent continued. 25,000 feet, 20,000, 18,000. Surrounding airspace was cleared of other traffic. Controllers watched their screens, hoping for any radio transmission, any sign that the crew was responding to the warnings they were broadcasting. 15,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. The transponder continued transmitting. Controllers could see the aircraft's exact position and altitude, but there was no communication, no emergency code, no indication of what was happening aboard that aircraft. At 10:40 a.m, radar contact was lost. The last recorded altitude was 6,800 feet, well below the elevation of the surrounding terrain. What occurred inside the cabin during this descent would later be reconstructed indirectly. The cockpit voice recorder captured sounds from the area immediately outside the cockpit door. These recordings provided investigators with critical context, even though they did not capture the passenger cabin itself. The cabin crew became aware the aircraft was descending. This was later confirmed through recovered evidence and analysis. No detailed account of passenger reactions appears in official reports. Investigators deliberately focused on cockpit procedures, aircraft systems, and objective data rather than speculation. At 10:41 a.m, Flight 9525 impacted terrain near Prades Haut-Bléon in the French Alps, at an elevation of approximately 5,000 feet. The location was in a remote area of the Alpes de Haute-Provence, characterized by steep ravines, dense vegetation, and limited accessibility. The nearest road was miles away, accessible only by narrow mountain paths. French authorities were notified immediately. The Gendarmerie Nationale coordinated the initial response. Emergency services mobilized helicopter units as ground access was impossible for rapid deployment. Mountain rescue teams were dispatched. Medical personnel prepared for potential survivors, though the circumstances suggested the worst. Teams reached the site later that afternoon, navigating difficult terrain and unstable slopes. They confirmed there were no survivors. Wreckage was scattered across a steep mountainside. The impact had been severe. The site was immediately secured and the investigation began. France's Bureau of Investigation and Analysis, known as the BEA, assumed lead responsibility. German and Spanish authorities joined the effort, along with technical advisors from Airbus and engine manufacturers. The investigation followed established international standards designed to determine not blame, but cause. Investigators were deployed to the site on March 24th. Helicopter access was required for personnel, equipment, and documentation. Work proceeded under difficult conditions on unstable slopes at high elevation. The immediate priority was locating the flight recorders. These devices are built to survive extreme impacts and are equipped with underwater locator beacons that emit signals for up to 30 days. In mountainous terrain, however, locating them requires systematic search of debris fields that can span hundreds of meters. On March 25th, the cockpit voice recorder was located among the debris. The device's protective casing had sustained impact damage, but the memory unit inside was intact. This was a critical development. The flight data recorder was recovered the following day. Its memory module was also preserved despite the severe impact forces. Both devices were immediately transported to BEA laboratories near Paris for detailed analysis under controlled conditions. The cockpit voice recorder captures all audio in the cockpit: pilot conversations, radio communications, warning systems, and ambient sounds. It provides investigators with a real-time audio record of crew actions and aircraft alerts. The flight data recorder monitors hundreds of parameters: altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance, control surface positions, and autopilot status. It creates a precise technical record of aircraft behavior. Together, these devices would provide the foundation for understanding what occurred. Initial examination of the physical wreckage revealed critical information. Investigators looked for specific patterns: pre-impact fire damage, structural failures, explosive residue, or evidence of bird strikes. They found none of these. The engines appeared to have been operating normally. Turbine blades showed damage patterns consistent with rotation at impact, indicating they were producing power when the aircraft struck terrain. Flight control surfaces were examined. Hydraulic lines were traced. Electrical systems were assessed. Aircraft systems showed no malfunctions. These findings were significant. The aircraft had been mechanically sound right up to the moment it struck terrain. Together, the recorders provided a detailed timeline of the final 30 minutes. The flight proceeded normally through climb and cruise. Both pilots were heard communicating during the initial phase, conducting standard cockpit procedures and coordinating with air traffic control. At 10:27 a.m., the aircraft reached 38,000 feet, with all systems functioning normally. Approximately 2 minutes later, audio indicated one pilot leaving the cockpit. This was a routine occurrence during cruise flight. Pilots regularly leave the flight deck for physiological breaks, and airline procedures accommodate this. At 10:30 a.m., the flight data recorder registered a change. The selected altitude in the autopilot was adjusted from 38,000 feet to 100 feet. This was the lowest selectable altitude on the Airbus A320. That single input initiated the descent controllers had been observing. Modern autopilot systems execute commands precisely. When a new altitude is selected below the current altitude, the system initiates a descent at a programmed rate. The aircraft will continue descending until it reaches the selected altitude, or until the crew intervenes. The Airbus descended at approximately 3,500 feet per minute, following the autopilot's commands exactly. The cockpit voice recorder then captured knocking sounds. Someone was requesting entry to the cockpit. The Airbus A320 is equipped with a reinforced cockpit door installed after September 11th as a security measure. The door is designed to resist forced entry, including attempts using tools or explosives. Access is controlled electronically from inside the cockpit. Under normal circumstances, a crew member outside can request entry using a keypad code. This triggers a buzzer inside the cockpit. The pilot inside can then unlock the door with a switch. However, the system includes an override function. If the pilot inside suspects a security threat, they can activate a lock that keeps the door secured for 5 minutes, preventing entry even with the correct code. This feature was designed to protect against hijacking. The knocking intensified. Audio recorded increasingly forceful impacts, consistent with repeated attempts to gain entry. Investigators later determined these sounds indicated attempts to break down the door using physical force. These sounds continued for several minutes as the aircraft maintained its steady descent. Air traffic control calls went unanswered. Controllers continued transmitting, asking for any response, declaring an emergency on the aircraft's behalf, and requesting confirmation of crew status. No response came. The flight data recorder showed no emergency codes transmitted via transponder, no radio calls made from the cockpit, no emergency alerts activated. The aircraft simply continued its programmed descent. As the aircraft descended below 10,000 feet, the ground proximity warning system activated. This system uses radar altimeter data and terrain databases to detect collision risks. Automated alerts sound in the cockpit, warning of terrain ahead and instructing the crew to pull up immediately. These warnings are designed to be unmistakable, loud, urgent, and impossible to ignore. The data showed no response. No control inputs were made to arrest the descent. No changes were made to the autopilot settings. No engine power adjustments. Attempts to re-enter the cockpit continued until the final moments. The cockpit voice recorder captured these impacts, growing more desperate as time progressed. Throughout this entire period, the aircraft maintained its programmed descent path. The engines operated normally, responding to auto-throttle commands. Flight controls responded as designed to autopilot inputs. Navigation systems tracked the programmed route. There were no system failures. There were no malfunctions. There were no technical emergencies. At 10:41 a.m., both recorders stopped simultaneously. Consistent with impact. From the moment the altitude was set to 100 feet until impact, there were no control inputs to alter the descent. The autopilot executed exactly what it had been commanded to do. The aircraft performed as designed, but the inputs it received directed it on a path into terrain. On March 26, the French prosecutor provided an initial briefing to media. Based on early analysis of the cockpit voice recorder, evidence suggested the descent had been initiated deliberately by the pilot, who remained in the cockpit. This announcement shifted the entire understanding of the accident. The BEA continued its technical investigation over the following months. In May 2015, an interim report confirmed the co-pilot had been alone in the cockpit during the descent and could not be contacted or accessed, despite repeated attempts by the captain. Investigators examined the cockpit door locking system in detail. They reviewed the design specifications, tested the override function, and analysed the timing of door lock activations recorded in the aircraft systems. The system includes an override that allows a pilot inside to keep the door locked for 5 minutes, even when the correct access code is entered from outside. After 5 minutes, the lock automatically resets, allowing another entry attempt, which can then be overridden again. Analysis showed this override had been used repeatedly throughout the descent, preventing the captain from re-entering despite having the proper code. The investigation also revealed a history of medical consultations. Records showed the co-pilot had sought treatment from multiple physicians in the weeks before the accident. Some of these consultations resulted in medical recommendations that should have precluded flying. That information had not been disclosed to the airline. At the time, aviation medical regulations relied heavily on self-reporting. Pilots were required to inform their employers and aviation medical authorities if they developed conditions that might affect their ability to fly safely. The system was dependent on individual compliance, with limited independent verification. The final report, published in March 2016, concluded the accident resulted from deliberate control inputs made by the co-pilot, who decided to use the aircraft systems to cause its destruction. Contributing factors included gaps in medical oversight and a cockpit security system that, while functioning exactly as designed for its intended purpose, could be misused by a pilot from inside. This was not mechanical failure. This was not a malfunction. This was not crew error in the traditional sense. The aircraft performed normally throughout. The accident resulted from deliberate actions using standard systems in ways existing safety frameworks had not anticipated. The response was immediate and global. On March 27, 2015, just 3 days after the accident, European aviation authorities issued an emergency directive requiring at least 2 authorized persons be present in the cockpit at all times during flight. If one pilot needed to leave, a flight attendant would enter and remain until the pilot returned. Flight attendants were briefed on the protocol. They would position themselves near the door, maintaining a presence without interfering with the flying pilot's duties. This became known as the rule of the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, Transport Canada, and aviation authorities across Asia and Australia quickly adopted similar requirements. Within weeks, the rule was standard practice on airlines worldwide. Some airlines already had versions of this policy in place. Investigators examined these existing procedures to understand what had worked and what hadn't. The new regulations incorporated best practices from carriers with the most developed protocols. In certain regions, the rule was later modified. Some authorities determined that enhanced monitoring and medical oversight could provide equivalent safety. Others maintained the two-person requirement permanently. Medical certification procedures were fundamentally re-examined. Authorities reviewed how medical information was collected, how physicians communicated with aviation medical examiners, and how airlines were notified of pilot fitness concerns. Germany's Federal Aviation Office, working with medical associations, developed new protocols requiring improved information sharing between treating physicians and aviation authorities. The goal was creating clear channels for doctors to report concerns while protecting pilots from automatic career termination for seeking treatment. The challenge was balancing safety with privacy and ensuring pilots felt safe seeking medical care rather than concealing conditions. Airlines expanded peer support programs and employee assistance initiatives. These programs trained volunteer pilots to provide confidential support to colleagues experiencing difficulties, serving as a bridge to professional resources when needed. The intent was encouraging early intervention rather than concealment. Pilots needed pathways to seek help without facing immediate loss of their medical certificates or careers. Training programs for airline management were updated to include recognition of behavioral indicators that might suggest a crew member needed support. The emphasis was on early assistance rather than punitive responses. The loss of Flight 9525 and all 150 people aboard remains a profound tragedy and a pivotal moment in aviation safety history. Commercial aviation advances through systematic learning from accidents. Each event reveals vulnerabilities in systems designed to prevent exactly these outcomes, and each event drives change. The two-person cockpit rule addressed an immediate vulnerability. Enhanced medical oversight improved early detection. Expanded support systems created environments where seeking help became acceptable. Each measure addressed specific factors that had contributed to this accident. Events like this remain exceptionally rare in commercial aviation. Statistical analysis of worldwide operations shows that such occurrences represent an infinitesimal fraction of the millions of flights conducted each year, but rarity does not diminish the importance of understanding what occurred, or the value of implementing preventative measures. The investigation reinforced the critical value of flight recorders. Without the detailed data these devices provided, determining what occurred would have been far more difficult. They gave investigators objective evidence when no other sources remained. That evidence drove changes that now protect every flight. Aviation continues evolving in response to lessons from accidents like Flight 9525. New procedures, enhanced training, improved medical oversight, and better understanding of human factors all contribute to ongoing safety improvements. While extremely rare, this case changed how investigators worldwide evaluate human factors in aviation accidents. It prompted examination of medical oversight, cockpit procedures, and support mechanisms across the entire industry. The changes implemented continue influencing aviation operations today. Aviation evolves because it must, and because the cost of not learning is measured in lives.